It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'll be your host this morning. Appreciate you riding with us. Those of you that are joining us on our website, welcome. Thank you. See you folks out there from Philadelphia. I see folks out there in Palm Coast, Sebastian, Florida, Chesterfield, Lincoln, I think that's Nebraska. So, and a few other locations. Don't get scared. I'm not the NSA. I can't tell who you are. I can only see what city you're listening from. So, this is our opening show for this week. Glad to be here. If you're listening to us on Patriot Facebook, that's patriotfb.com. That's great news. We're streaming there on Patriot Radio. We're also available as a streaming live podcast on their website, which is patriotfb.com. FB like Foxtrot Bravo. If you're listening to us on 99.3, Big Country 99 out in South Central Missouri, welcome. Glad to have you. And grateful that the folks over there at Big Country 99 feel strongly enough about our nation that they would be willing to carry a show that's out of genre for a radio station that normally plays country and top popular music. Guys over there wear these ball caps and bill caps and cowboy hats by day, and then they take those off, and at night they put on a tri-corner Patriot hat. So that's good news. We're going to cover a couple of different topics this morning, not the least of which is that we really want to address or take a look at some of the things that are pertinent in our situation right now. One, the courts, because there's some free speech issues out there, privacy, and the topic that I want to kind of focus in on is the mistaken concept that people have that the court is the determining arbiter or the final arbiter of our liberties and our freedoms. And what I posit is that what we see today is nothing more than a form of judicial terrorism from the court systems. When they approve and grant extraordinary powers that are outside of their constitutional authorization, it is exactly that. Some people are polite about it and they call it judicial activism. I don't. I call it exactly what it is, which is judicial terrorism. Why do I say the word terrorism? Well, it's fairly simple. When the premise of a decision or the premise of an action is to create a change in behavior based upon fear, terrorism is the word that jumps to mind as the definition. And so what we see are courts that are, for all intents and purposes, doing essentially that. They are basically determining that we are subject to their rulings by power that they've usurped and given themselves. And that's a problem. Our second topic is going to be extraordinary crisis. Now, that is a statement and a verbatim statement brought out by an individual whose name is Harlan Ullman. And there's a link to the story there about how he works for this think tank. And his concept is that in this Atlantic Council meeting, in an article that he wrote, he's basically stating that we need an extraordinary crisis in order to preserve the New World Order. Now, here you see the words from the mouth of a tyrant himself. Forget the source, because a lot of people out there are like, I don't like InfoWars. They're controlled opposition, or they're a Jewish front, and all. I don't even care what the source is. The goal of this show, and if you haven't caught on by now, is the source is not material. More often than not, I post the source up there so that you can see it, read it for yourself, and then make your own determination based upon your own critical thinking, your Socratic critical thinking. I trust you enough that you will not blindly read what you're told and believe it as if it came out of the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Your job is to be discerning, to read between the lines, to identify what the truth and the facts are, separate from the propaganda you're fed, regardless of what the source is. And I don't care whether that's your own favorite biased blog, or your own favorite alternative media, or the mainstream ministry of propaganda, or a speech you hear, or anything else. You have an obligation to utilize your skills, the gift and the brilliance that God has given you, and to tune that with Socratic critical thinking, and then draw your own conclusions to formulate your own opinions, rather than parrot someone else's. So, when people send me arguments that say that, you shouldn't use this link or that link, stop right there. First of all, don't tell me what to do. It's my show. If you don't like it, do your own. Secondarily, the goal of all of this, and you'll see me post articles up there from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times and MSLSD. Are you suggesting that because I post those articles that I wholeheartedly believe in their methodology or thought process or bias? Of course not. So why would you think the same from a conservative or an alternative media source? My job is just to get you to the water. It's your job to drink it and slake your thirst. This elitist monster, in the form of this guy Ullman, is openly suggesting a global false flag event in order to reestablish governmental dominance, because in his own words, he's basically stating that, the internet and the rise of open intelligence that's coming out from alternative media and so forth is dangerous. In other words, it's the old adage of the slaves are reading books and they're becoming dangerous. Our third topic is going to be the NSA will continue its abuse of our Fourth Amendment rights and our privacies and our liberties, despite the president's promises to the contrary. Now, the reason I say that is because the president over the weekend came out and stated that he is going to rein in the NSA, and yet, at the same point in time, we have Feinstein coming out telling us to get used to the idea that there are these massive databases on us, and that we need to get used to it. Our fourth topic is going to be Missouri initiates legislation to restore state sovereignty. So let's talk a little bit about those when we get a chance. Before we get into our first topic, which is the courts and free speech, privacy, and judicial terrorism, let's quickly make sure that you're supporting and patronizing our listeners, or our advertisers. You can find the guys over at Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop. They're at Court Square in West Plains, 417-257-1776. Make sure that while you're there and you're picking up a cigar or a pipe or tobacco or whatever your accessory is, that you slip into Wits End Classic Barbershop. Get yourself a haircut. I'm sure you'll be glad that you did. Great opportunity to meet some other great fine folks, by the way, that hang out in there and go in there and get their hair cut, and also go into the back in the Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop. Make sure that you visit Jason Henry over on Court Square if you are in West Plains, if you have a legal issue that you need to deal with. He handles both federal and state cases, which is unusual for this area, in the sense that not a lot of attorneys are qualified to practice in front of federal court. he is. And not only is he qualified, but he's, you have to go through a court approval process, and of course he's done that. He does practice in federal court, and he specializes in federal gun cases as well as state firearms cases. So make sure that you visit him or call him at 417-256-4100. He also does other criminal cases like DUIs and things like that. Make sure you see our friends over at Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner Boulevard. They can take care of you for lunch virtually every day of the week. On Tuesday nights, they have a family night where kids under 12 eat free. And so you can get in there and for relatively little dollars, do a family meal. And then, of course, our friends over at Battery Station, they can be reached at batterystation.com. And you can also call them at 417-257-7799. Okay. Excuse me, I'm still getting over this. I lost my voice as a result of being sick. So if you'll forgive me the fact that I am hoarse and scratchy, not much I can do about it at this point. If you'd like to call into the show to put your input into any of these issues, including courts and so forth, you're welcome to do so. You can call us at 417-204-5141. It's 417-204-5141. You can also call into our listen line, and you can listen to the program 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at your leisure, on your personal National Security Administration or sponsored personal tracking device, the one that you have unlimited minutes on. That you can simply do, or a home phone if you like. That number is 415-325-0725. It's 415-325-0725. It's a great way for you to catch AVN and share it with friends instead of sending them a link or something like that. Or just give them that phone number and tell them, look, just call this and listen to the show for an hour. And you'd be surprised how many people will continue to come back time and time and time again. Of course, you can always find us at americasvoicenow.org. So here's the deal. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated that they're going to weigh in on cell phone searches by the police. Now, here's the problem that we have. For starters, the idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of the Constitution and of the liberties addressed therein is a misnomer. In other words, it's a false choice that we're constantly beaten with or beaten over the head with. The Supreme Court is not the final arbiter of the Constitution. The fact of the matter remains that our founders told us that it was not the Supreme Court, but the people themselves. In fact, Alexander Hamilton made a very clear statement to that effect, and here's what he said. Quote, I maintain that the, and by the way, this is in reference to not the Supreme Court, but the Supremacy Clause. Now, for the record, the Supremacy Clause, as you know, everyone says that federal law trumps state law, and this relates to nullification issues and such. I maintain that the word supreme imports no more than this, that the Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof cannot be controlled or defeated by any other law. The acts of the United States, therefore, will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the federal government. But the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere. And when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme nor binding. Now, that statement, which was addressed and pointing towards the Supremacy Clause itself, also addresses the Supreme Court. Because when the Congress, or any law made by any administrative agency, which of course they didn't have at that time, when it departs from the sphere of laws which are passed in pursuance of the Constitution, when they depart from that, then those laws are no longer supreme nor binding. And I would dare say to you that when we talk about things like the court the other day came out and stated that bloggers have a First Amendment protection. Now, this is a federal appeals court, so it may well go to the Supreme Court yet, but here's the point. Why is it that we feel like we need the courts to verify for us that which our founders expressed to us clearly in writing, pointed out and clarified repeatedly over and over and over again, and furthermore, which our Creator gave us and embedded in us. I mean, you know that you have a right to free speech. You don't need someone to confirm that or affirm that for you. I mean, thanks for telling us, court, what we already know to be the case. That God has imbued us with those rights of free speech and free thought. And our founders clarified it for us in writing to make sure that we fully understood that those were rights that were not granted to us by government, but by God itself. And we've really known this all along. I mean, you know in the back of your mind that your right to free speech and privacy and right to possess a firearm for your own self-defense and the defense of your nation, and your right not to be coerced or tricked or manipulated or threatened into speaking out against your own best interest, you know all of those things are natural human rights. Again, I point to something Jefferson said. This is related directly to the court. You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiter of all constitutional questions. It's a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. Now, here's what I want you to do. This is up on our Facebook page. It's up on our YouTube. It'll be in the body of the YouTube discussion here. What I want you to do is I want you to read that statement a few times until it really, truly sinks in. I want you to take it and take those words, and I want them like a cookie. I want you to put them in your mouth, and I want you to chew them. And then I want you to sit there and just taste them. Because I want you to fully understand and memorize the concept, the taste, the texture, the tone of truth. You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. When he said that, he was referencing the Supreme Court itself. He was stating that the Constitution never created a godlike figure in the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. When you hear me say SCOTUS, that's what I'm talking about. Nowhere did the Constitution or the founders ever believe that SCOTUS had some exclusive right or final determinative capabilities of law or constitutional rights. For the court to believe that they have the right to rescind or strip or limit your rights, or to make a determination on whether cell phone searches by police is legal, is hubris, arrogance, and self-serving. It's judicial terrorism. If they find against you, against your best interest, against natural law, against God-given law, against creator law. That's it, folks. The court doesn't have a right to decide whether police can search an arrested criminal suspect's cell phone without a warrant. You see, they have given themselves that right. They've usurped it. In fact, I had a discussion with an attorney about this the other day. And he's adamant about the fact, of course he's an attorney, so he's been trained with the mentality that the courts can make the determination of what is right and what is wrong, and what is constitutional and what's not, what is the extent to which government can determine your rights. Well, I completely and wholeheartedly disagree with the concept. Under no circumstances does any court have the right to make the determination as to what my Creator has embedded and imbued within me as a human being. And it doesn't matter whether I live in the United States or elsewhere. The idea that some court can make that determination on my behalf and then place me under the stricture that they have created to define where my rights end is a misnomer. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how tyranny gives and grants itself credibility and authority. It makes a determination in a governmental sense, usually under legislative decree, and then uses the courts to put a stamp of approval over that, effectively granting itself authority and power it does not possess. And that is judicial terrorism. It's not judicial activism. Activism is completely different. This is a level of coercion which is tantamount to holding a gun to your head. Because the implication is that those courts can then utilize whatever those new powers are to grant authority they don't have the authority themselves to grant to agencies like police departments, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the EPA, and you can go on down and down and down the list. Just because 9 justices sit up there and say that we have determined in our infinite wisdom, which I would question from Jump Street, that it's legal or illegal. See, here's the problem. The courts, as a general rule, always utilize precedent to look at how to rule in a case. Well, in a true, honest jurisprudence, what would happen is the courts would not look at prior judges' rulings to determine how they ruled on an earlier unrelated case. What would happen is the courts would go back to the intent of the contract, what the founders had to say, what their intention was. And I defy any court to read the writings of Thomas Jefferson and who says, you seem to consider judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. And I would defy any judge to read that and then feel as if he or she then has a right to rule on your freedoms and liberties. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to tackle our second topic, which is extraordinary crisis. This is an extraordinary crisis idea, which is dangerous indeed. We'll be right back. We have returned. You're listening to America's Voice now. So, when I look at government, and I look at courts, and I look at these people who try to determine how they can get around limitations on your individualism, your ability to think freely, speak freely, and so forth and so on, I'm always kind of stunned and shocked and amazed that they actually believe they have the right to determine what's in our best interest. I mean, who is one person or 9 people or 535 people to make a determination that they can decide what the other 315 million of us are going to do? I'm not saying that there should not be any government. I'm saying that government should be so microscopic in its dimension, in its scope, in its influence and impact in our lives that we should have to look for it with an electron microscope in order to find it in our lives. I'm saying that the federal government was intended to be so obscure to the average citizen that it would have almost no impact on their day in and day out life. I'm saying that state governments should be so miniature that you have to look hard to find them in your life. And I'm saying that what totalitarianists and statists of all stripes and blends and flavors all decide is how they can impose their will upon us. And they have no problem whatsoever utilizing whatever tactics are available to them under their scope of authority and power, which more often than not is usurped in the first place, to accomplish that end. Harlan Ullman, he's writing for the Atlantic Council, and he works for a think tank based in Washington, D.C. He has come out and warned that an extraordinary crisis is needed to preserve, quote, the New World Order, which is under threat of being derailed by non-state actors like Edward Snowden is one of the examples he gives, and Bradley Manning and others. Now, let's understand what that statement means for a moment, because if you take it in its true context and you think about what he's actually saying here, he's saying that the information that has been presented to the world and the concept that people have access to information through alternative media, a non-controlled source, is dangerous to the status of the tyrants and the elitists themselves. Well, you're darn right it is. But he's calling for an extraordinary crisis in order to regain control. The article says the Atlantic Council, which he works for, is this think tank. It's a highly influential organization, close ties to major policymakers. It's headed up by a group of other past government, individuals, including Brent Scowcroft, the former United States National Security Advisor. He was an advisor under Ford and Bush the Senior. And he's also been an advisor to Obama. And Harlan Ullman, the author of this particular article, he was the author of the shock and awe concept that was employed in Iraq when we went in for Saddam Hussein. He's now the chairman of the Kiloween Group, which advises government leaders. So in other words, these people leave their government service, whatever it may have been, migrate into these think tanks, which are funded by God only knows who and what. Many of them are private, so there's no way to know what their funding is all about and where it comes from. And then they utilize their past contacts to essentially influence policy and leadership in the United States. And they always approach it from the perspective of their past experience, which was as a sometimes minor, sometimes major cog in the wheel of tyranny. So what do you think their end result is always going to be? What do you think their policies are going to always engender? He wrote this article entitled "The War on Terror is Not the Only Threat," in which he basically, and I've read it, it's very brief, and you can read it yourself. He's asserting that, quote, tectonic changes are reshaping the geostrategic system. And his argument is that our concern should not be things like military superpowers like China, but what we should be concerned about is people like Edward Snowden, Bradley Manning, anonymous hackers who pose the threat to the 365-year-old Westphalian system. Because, get this, they encourage individuals to become self-empowered, eviscerating state control. That's a curious way to look at things, isn't it? In other words, this is the age-old argument that if you let them slaves read and own guns, they're going to want their freedom. What an interesting concept. You know, he's not the first to come out with these kinds of statements. We've heard this many, many times before from all of these elitists. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a monster, and you ought to, if you don't know who he is, you should educate yourself about him. Recently, in 2010, he told the Council on Foreign Relations meeting that the global political awakening, and he's not really referencing only the United States of America, but the planet-wide rise in people who desire freedom and liberty. And he says that it's threatening to derail the one world government movement. Now, Ullman is basically calling for an extraordinary crisis to reinvigorate support for state power and big government. And when you think about that, and we look back at what's been done over historical windows to accomplish that same end, and I'm thinking now the sinking of the Lusitania. I'm thinking of Pearl Harbor. I'm thinking of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. In other words, there is plenty of evidence out there that governments in the past have committed crimes of false flag, of a false flag nature, which have been used to force change based upon government sponsoring or government being the sponsored, dominating factor. In other words, how do we get people to give us more authority, or how do we take authority and then justify its growth and expansion based upon a danger that in most cases is phantom in its nature? Well, the sinking of the Lusitania was a perfect example. The people who sank it knew doggone well that it was in their territory. The Germans sank the Lusitania, but the English and the Americans who were using it to ship and transport weapons, they wanted it sunk. They wanted that event to occur because it gave them the justification to go back to the American people and say, now you should be outraged enough to enable us to, with this extraordinary crisis, kick off a global war. Now, when we look at Pearl Harbor, we see the same exact event or series of events occurring, albeit with a different outcome. But Pearl Harbor was well known that the attack was slated and scheduled and in the works long before it actually occurred. In fact, and this is not me saying this, and this is not some kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy, the evidence is out there, and it's clear for anyone to go look at. We removed 4/5 of the entire fleet from the island just a week prior to the attack because they didn't want to lose the entire Navy. The men and women who died in Pearl Harbor were sacrificed because they needed an excuse to enter the war. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. They needed an excuse to enter into World War II. The American people wanted nothing to do with it, similar to the outcry when we tried to go into Syria not so long ago, similar to the outcry when we went into Afghanistan, when we went into Iraq, similar to the outcry when we went into Vietnam, Korea. You see, people, as a general rule, we don't want war. Governments want war. Governments want an excuse to grow and expand their power and authority, and ultimately that always ends up being what? Tyranny. There's no way around it. The concept of government needing control is only a self-serving end in and of itself. In other words, it's a means to an end. And we know from past historical and empirical proof that government, our own government, has utilized the tricks, if you will, of false flag events and extraordinary crises to accomplish just that. So I ask you, are you suggesting, if you believe that I'm incorrect here, are you suggesting that, for all intents and purposes, the individuals that we have in our government today are more trustworthy than the people that led us into World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan? I hardly think so. In fact, I think the level of moral fiber and resolve in our current society today and reflected in our own government is far lower than it was even then. In fact, I don't think these people even care so much to hide what they're doing like they did back in 1914 and in 1939 and 1941. I don't think they care. I think they're so confident that they have the media wrapped around their finger that they're pretty confident that you're never going to find out about it anyway. Without an extraordinary crisis, writes Ullman, little is likely to be done to reverse or limit the damage imposed by failed or failing governance. Wow. Holy smoke. Listen to that statement again. Without an extraordinary crisis, little is likely to be done to reverse or limit the damage imposed by failed or failing governance. In other words, basically what he's stating here is that unless we have an extraordinary crisis that allows government to utilize that as an excuse to reassert its steely control of tyranny over us, because of the need to contain the new risk or threat, as it may be. I mean, this is unbelievable that the man has the chutzpah, if you will, the hubris, the arrogance to come out and make a statement like that in public. He goes on to say that very few have taken note and fewer have acted on this realization that information revolution and instantaneous global communications are thwarting the New World Order. Well, that tells me a couple of things if I read between the lines there. One, this man is stating the obvious, that they're worried because there is a planet-wide resurgence in the concept of liberty and freedom. Everywhere that you look, with the exception of Islamic dominated theocracies, you see the citizens themselves seeking a relief from government tyranny. And it's not just in the United States of America. The European Union is under an extraordinary amount of pressure from the citizens themselves because they are beginning to see the failed results of this governance concept that government should dictate basically the rules of everything, control all commerce and all manufacturing and all means and method of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that you're basically here to support them in their effort, whatever that effort may be. The people in the European Union are recognizing the ineptitude, the impotence, and the failure of those who are creating quote-unquote policy that affects their lives, and yet they have no control over the failures of those policies. It's like trying to sit there and herd, all right, if you've ever watched a cattle drive on television, you know that it takes multiple people to continue to move the herd forward and to go back and pick up the stragglers and to make sure that they're moving in the direction that you want them to go. Generally, you've got one person out front who's leading, and then you have others on the flanks and in the rear moving the herd forward and containing those who would, wander off in a different direction. In this instance, what we have is a series of failed leaders who have constantly led us into either a boxed canyon, that means that we have to turn around and backtrack, or they constantly lead us to the edge of a cliff face. And what they're recognizing is that we are not cattle in the sense that we're that easily herded. We want and seek and desire freedom. And we're not willing to just, follow the rump in front of us, so to speak. What that tells you, and for the record, I posted an article up here this morning, which I'm not incorporating into today's programming, but there is a serious financial crisis about to bubble and burst in China. The article is called Mega Default in China is scheduled for January 31st. They have the same problem about to explode in their system that we had back in 2008. In other words, loose capital and loose lending policies, high interest rates for these loans that are based upon nothing. There is the Chinese state media reported from the China Credit Trust Company and was warning investors they may not be repaid when one of their wealth management products matures in January 31st. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China told the China Credit Trust products sold the China Credit Trust products to its customers, and now they're suggesting that they may not be able to compensate those investors when it comes time for the maturity of those. Now, when you were talking about this is a $500 million security, and the coal company that they lent the money to borrowed it at something like 12%. Now they're, of course, unable to come up with the money to pay the bond back, and so it's threatening to. And here's what you need to know about this. This is the first of a series of similar dominoes that are behind the Chinese growth. My point is simply this. The United States, the European Union, and the Asian world under the Chinese domination recognize that we've reached a point at which and including the IMF, in which we've limited ourselves out. We've tapped out all the resources that there are to tap. We can no longer manufacture money from nothing. We have debt that exceeds our global planetoid assets in magnitudes, by the way. And so they are looking for an excuse to trigger a cataclysmic, extraordinary event that will enable them to rise the phoenix of tyranny from the ashes of global freedom. Folks, I'm telling you right now, I don't know what form it'll take. I don't know what the day is. I don't know what the hour is. I don't have that privilege. But I can tell you this. Those who are not looking at this in its truest light and understanding where this is headed are willfully refusing to recognize the obvious. That the elements that are converging on a global level to create the perfect storm of world events, to enable the clampdown of a very, very, very dangerous level of tyranny. And when you've got guys out there like Mr. Think Tank Ullman, who is basically saying that we need an extraordinary crisis to preserve the New World Order, the one that really comes to mind is a global financial crisis. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to tackle our third topic. The NSA will continue in their illegal efforts despite the presidential promises that he's going to rein in these agencies. Before we get there, make sure that you visit our friends over at Patriot Cigar and Tobacco. Those folks can be found at 2 Court Square or reached via phone at 417-257-1776. And Wits End Classic Barbershop, right there on the square in West Plains. Great place to get a haircut and a shave. Law offices of Jason Henry at number 10 Court Square, 417-256-4100 for all of your needs related to criminal activity, any kind of criminal charges that you've been hit with, both federal and state. Make sure that you see Jason Henry to solve those problems for you. Our friends over at Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner in West Plains, they offer a great lunch special, salad, and a pizza bar and pasta bar every day. And then families eat free, or I should say kids eat free on family night on Tuesday evenings. The Battery Station, and they are located at batterystation.com on the web. Very, very few of the products that they carry outside of the batteries and the flashlights are on that website, but you're certainly welcome to go there anyway. If not, you can call them and ask them if they have a product that you need at 417-257-7799. And then if you'd like to share with your friends how they can get America's Voice now, you can call 415-325-0725 as our new listen line. You can listen to the show 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at your leisure and convenience. And it's a simple way to share with others the opportunity to hear AVN. You simply give them that listen line at 415-325-0725.